The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a swirl of dust and disappointment, leaving behind a woman who'd traveled 300 miles for a lie. Clara Whitmore stood on the cracked wooden platform of Millfield Station, her sturdy frame wrapped in a worn brown traveling dress, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The Wyoming territory stretched before her in endless waves of golden grass and broken promises, and somewhere in the distance, a baby's cry pierced the afternoon air like a knife through silk. She clutched the letter in her gloved hand, the letter that had brought her here, that had filled her nights with dreams of a kitchen to call her own, of children's laughter echoing through a real home, instead of the endless succession of boarding houses and cruel whispers that had followed her across 3 states. The letter from Samuel Crawford, rancher and widower, seeking a cook and housekeeper for his remote homestead. He'd never asked about her appearance. She'd never volunteered the truth that would have sent him running before he'd finished reading her careful script. The other passengers had already scattered like leaves in an autumn wind, claimed by waiting families, swept into carriages, absorbed into the fabric of this frontier town. But Clara remained, abandoned on the platform, with her battered trunk and the growing certainty that Samuel Crawford had taken one look at her and decided that some promises weren't worth keeping. She was not the slender, delicate creature he'd imagined. She was built for work, not for wanting, broad-shouldered and full-figured, with hands that had kneaded 10,000 loaves of bread and arms that had carried water buckets since she was 12 years old. The station master, a thin man with suspicious eyes, approached with the careful steps of someone delivering bad news. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a situation. Mr. Crawford sends his regrets, but the position has been filled." His voice carried the hollow ring of a rehearsed lie. Clara's throat tightened, but she kept her chin high. She'd heard variations of this rejection before, though never after traveling so far. "I see. Might I trouble you for directions to the nearest boarding house?" Her voice remained steady, betraying nothing of the storm raging beneath her composed exterior. "Well, ma'am, there ain't exactly. That is to say." The station master shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the settling dust where Crawford's buggy had disappeared. "He did mention something about a medical emergency. Seems his baby took sick sudden-like." A baby, the cry she'd heard moments ago. Clara's maternal instincts, honed through years of caring for other people's children, stirred like embers touched by wind. "How sick?" she asked, her voice sharper now, cutting through propriety. The station master's face darkened. "Bad sick, from what I gather. Fever and such. Doc's out of town for another week, and—" He trailed off, studying Clara's face with new attention. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about tending sick little ones, would you?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was her chance, not the one she'd dreamed of, but perhaps the one she needed. "I've delivered 3 babies and nursed a dozen through every fever known to frontier medicine," she said quietly. "If there's a child suffering, Mr. Crawford's feelings about my appearance can wait." The station master nodded slowly, respect flickering in his weathered features. "I reckon they can at that. His place is 2 miles north, past the broken windmill. Follow the creek bed when the road splits." As Clara hoisted her trunk onto the hired wagon that would carry her toward an uncertain future, she whispered a prayer to whatever angels watched over desperate women and sick babies. She was nobody's first choice, nobody's dream come true. But sometimes when the world grew dark enough, even unwanted hands could become exactly what was needed. The wagon lurched forward, carrying her toward Samuel Crawford's ranch, toward a baby's desperate cries, toward a chance to prove that worth wasn't measured in dress sizes or marriage proposals. In her traveling bag, along with her cooking knives and precious herbs, she carried the stubborn hope that sometimes the least wanted could become the most necessary. Today she would discover if mercy had room for the unwanted. The Crawford ranch house crouched against the horizon like a wounded animal, its weathered boards gray with age and neglect. Clara's wagon rolled to a stop before a porch that sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters, and she immediately understood why Samuel Crawford might need help. This wasn't the prosperous spread she'd imagined from his carefully worded letters. This was a man barely holding on, fighting a losing battle against the wilderness and his own grief. The baby's cries reached her before she'd even climbed down from the wagon, high and desperate, the sound that every woman recognizes as a child in distress. Clara paid the wagon driver quickly, her hands already itching to get inside to assess the situation. She learned long ago that when babies cried like that, time wasn't a luxury anyone could afford. She knocked once on the front door, waited exactly 3 seconds, then pushed it open. "Mr. Crawford? I'm Clara Whitmore. I believe you need help." The scene inside stopped her cold. The main room was chaos, dishes scattered across a rough wooden table, baby clothes draped over chairs to dry, medical supplies spread across every surface in the desperate arrangement of someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. And in the center of it all, pacing like a caged wolf, was Samuel Crawford himself. He was not what she'd expected. The man who'd written those careful, measured letters was tall and lean, with dark hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in weeks, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His sleeves were rolled up, his vest unbuttoned, and there was a wild edge to his movements that spoke of a man pushed beyond his limits. When he saw her, he stopped mid-stride, his gaze sweeping over her with the desperate assessment of someone who'd grab any lifeline offered. "You're not," he began, then stopped himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The agency said they were sending someone younger, someone prettier, someone who fit whatever picture you had in your mind," Clara finished calmly, setting down her bag and removing her gloves with the efficient movements of a woman ready for work. "I imagine they did. But what you have right now is a sick baby and a woman who's delivered more children than you've seen winters. So the question isn't whether I'm what you ordered, Mr. Crawford. The question is whether you want to waste time talking about my appearance while your child suffers." Samuel's mouth opened, then closed. The baby's cries intensified from somewhere deeper in the house, and Clara saw something in his face crumble. The last pretense of control, the final wall between desperation and admission of need. "He's been sick for 3 days, Samuel said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Fever, won't take food, cries like something's breaking inside him. Doc Peterson's been called to Cheyenne for some emergency surgery. Won't be back for a week at least. Mrs. Hendricks from town was helping, but her own grandbaby took sick and—" Clara was already moving toward the sound of the crying, her practical mind cataloging symptoms and possibilities. "How high is the fever? Has he been keeping liquids down? When did he last wet his diaper?" The questions came rapid fire as she followed the wailing to a small bedroom at the back of the house. The baby lay in a rough wooden cradle that Samuel had obviously built himself, his tiny face flushed red with fever, his little fist clenched in distress. Clara's heart clenched as she knelt beside the cradle, her experienced hands already reaching out to assess temperature, check for signs of dehydration, feel for the telltale swelling that might indicate serious illness. "Sweet boy," she murmured, her voice taking on the gentle croon that had soothed countless frightened children. "What's got you so upset? Her fingers found his pulse, rapid but strong, and checked his breathing. Hot, but not dangerously so. Upset stomach, most likely, possibly teeth coming in early. Samuel hovered behind her like an anxious shadow. "I've tried everything. Cool cloths, the tonic from town. Even tried to get some milk down him. But he just won't." "Men," Clara said with gentle exasperation, already rolling up her sleeves. "You've been fighting the symptoms instead of the cause. This little one doesn't need tonic. He needs comfort and the right kind of care." She turned to face Samuel, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw him really look at her. Not at her size or her plain features, but at the capable hands, the calm confidence, the unmistakable competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Can you help him?" The question came out raw, stripped of pride or pretense. Clara smiled for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach. "Mr. Crawford, I once nursed 7 children through scarlet fever in the middle of a blizzard with nothing but wild herbs and determination. Your boy has a touch of colic and possibly some stomach upset. Give me an hour and I'll have him sleeping like an angel." She turned back to the baby, her hands already moving with practiced efficiency. But first, I need you to put some water on to boil, find me the cleanest cloths you have, and if you've got any fennel or chamomile in your kitchen, bring it to me. Can you do that?" Samuel nodded, relief flooding his features like sunrise after a long night. As he hurried to follow her instructions, Clara lifted the baby from his cradle with the gentle confidence of a woman born to nurture. The crying began to ease almost immediately, as if the child could sense that capable hands had finally arrived. "There now, sweet boy," she whispered, beginning the slow, rhythmic rocking that had calmed countless babies before him. "Nobody wants a fat girl, do they? But when the little ones cry, when they need someone who knows how to fix what's broken, well then suddenly nobody cares about pretty anymore, do they?" The baby's cries faded to whimpers, then to the soft, hiccuping breaths of exhaustion, finally giving way to trust. And in the kitchen, Samuel Crawford found himself moving faster than he had in days, driven by the first real hope he'd felt since his son fell ill. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass like a promise, and Clara Whitmore began the delicate work of proving that sometimes the most unwanted could become exactly what was most needed. Within an hour, the Crawford ranch house had been transformed from chaos into something resembling order. Clara moved through the rooms like a gentle hurricane, her capable hands bringing organization to the scattered remnants of Samuel's desperate attempts at childcare. The baby, little Thomas, she'd learned his name was, lay sleeping peacefully in his cradle for the first time in 3 days, his fever broken, his breathing easy and natural. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching her work, marveling at the efficiency with which she'd turned his kitchen into a functional space again. She'd prepared a weak fennel tea that settled Thomas's stomach, used cool cloths in precisely the right way to bring down his fever without shocking his system, and somehow managed to clean and organize while moving with the quiet grace of someone who understood that peace was as important as medicine when it came to healing. "How did you know?" he asked finally, his voice still rough with the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights. "The doc said it might be pneumonia, maybe something worse, but you took one look and—" Clara smiled, wiping her hands on a clean towel. "Dr. Peterson is a good man, I'm sure, but he's a bachelor who's never spent a night walking the floors with a colicky baby. Sometimes book learning can't replace the kind of knowledge that comes from actually caring for children day in and day out." She moved to check on Thomas once more, her touch feather-light as she confirmed his temperature was normal. "Your wife," Clara said gently, "she passed in childbirth?" Samuel's face tightened, but he nodded. "Complications. The baby came early, and Ellen, she was so small, so delicate. The doc said there was nothing anyone could have done, but—" He trailed off, lost in memories too painful to voice. "You've been doing this alone for how long?" Clara's voice held no judgment, only the practical assessment of someone calculating the scope of a problem. 8 months. Mrs. Hendricks helped at first, in some of the neighbor women, but they all have their own families, their own troubles. And Thomas, he's been sickly from the start. Premature, you know. The doc said he might not make it through his first winter, that babies born that early often. "Nonsense," Clara interrupted firmly. "Premature babies need extra care, that's true, but they're often stronger than anyone gives them credit for. They have to be. They've been fighting from their very first breath." She turned from the cradle to face Samuel directly. "Your son is going to be just fine, Mr. Crawford. But he needs consistency, proper nutrition, and someone who understands infant care. The question is whether you're willing to let someone like me provide that care." Samuel studied her face, seeing for the first time the strength that lay beneath her unremarkable exterior. Clara Whitmore was not the young, pretty bride he'd imagined when he'd first placed his advertisement for a housekeeper. She was something far more valuable, a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she could do, who didn't waste time on false modesty or useless apologies for her appearance. "The truth is," Samuel said slowly, "I can't afford to pay much. The ranch has been struggling, and with the medical expenses and the cost of hiring help from town—" He gestured helplessly at the evidence of his financial constraints visible in every corner of the modest house. Clara's expression didn't change. "The truth is, Mr. Crawford, I don't have anywhere else to go. The position I came here for was filled before I arrived, and my savings are nearly exhausted. So perhaps we can help each other. I need a place to stay and work that has meaning. You need someone who can care for your son and manage your household. The question isn't about money. It's about whether you can accept help from someone who doesn't fit your expectations. Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, they could see three riders approaching the house. Well-dressed men on good horses, the kind who rode with the confidence of those who owned everything they surveyed. Samuel's face darkened. Damn, I wasn't expecting them today. Who are they? Clara asked, noting the tension that had suddenly filled Samuel's frame. Local businessmen, led by Marcus Thornfield. He owns the bank, the general store, and about half the grazing land in this county. They've been pressuring me to sell the ranch. Made what they call a generous offer after Ellen died. Samuel's voice carried the bitter edge of a man who knew exactly how generous such offers usually were. The riders dismounted with the casual authority of men who considered themselves welcome everywhere. Marcus Thornfield was exactly what Clara had expected. Well-fed, expensively dressed, with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never been told no. His companions were cut from the same cloth, successful men who saw the world as a series of acquisitions waiting to be made. Thornfield knocked once on the door before pushing it open without waiting for permission. Crawford, hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd check on you and the boy. Heard in town there was some sickness going around. His gaze swept the room, taking in the evidence of Clara's organization, the peaceful quiet where chaos had reigned that morning, and finally settling on Clara herself. His expression shifted subtly, the automatic dismissal of someone who didn't warrant serious consideration. And who might this be? Thornfield asked, his tone carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for hired help. This is Miss Whitmore, Samuel said carefully. She's helping with Thomas in the household. Ah, finally hired proper help, did you? Thornfield's smile was sharp as a blade. Though I have to say, Crawford, if you're hiring servants, it suggests you're not as ready to accept our offer as circumstances would indicate. Struggling ranchers don't usually expand their household staff. Clara felt the insult like a physical blow, but she'd learned long ago to armor herself against such casual cruelty. Instead, she stepped forward with the quiet dignity of someone who refused to be diminished by other people's small-mindedness. Actually, gentlemen, she said calmly, I'm not hired help. I'm here as a partner in Mr. Crawford's enterprise, contributing my skills in exchange for a share in the ranch's future success. The lie came easily, but it carried the ring of truth in her confident delivery. Thornfield's eyebrows rose, and his companions exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of any enterprise that would take such a woman as partner. I see. Well, Miss Whitmore, I hope Crawford has explained the challenges facing this particular piece of property. The drought, the debt, the general decline in productivity. Perhaps your partnership includes an assessment of the financial realities? Clara smiled, her voice remaining perfectly pleasant. Oh, I've assessed quite a lot, Mr. Thornfield. For instance, I've assessed that healthy babies and well-managed households tend to thrive regardless of temporary setbacks. I've also assessed that men who must travel in groups to pressure struggling neighbors might not be quite as confident in their positions as they appear. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Thornfield's smile became predatory, but before he could respond, Thomas woke from his nap and began to fuss. Not the desperate crying of the morning, but the normal sounds of a healthy baby wanting attention. Clara moved immediately to the cradle, lifting Thomas with practiced ease. The baby settled against her shoulder with the contentment of a child who felt completely secure. The contrast between this peaceful scene and the chaos Thornfield had obviously expected to find was not lost on anyone in the room. Remarkable, Thornfield said dryly. The boy looks significantly better than the last time we visited. Your partnership appears to be having immediate benefits, Crawford. Perhaps we were premature in our concerns about your ability to maintain this property. Samuel straightened, something in his posture shifting as he watched Clara gentle his son with effortless competence. Perhaps you were, Marcus, and perhaps the rumors of this ranch's decline have been greatly exaggerated. As the businessmen took their leave, with considerably less swagger than they'd arrived with, Samuel found himself looking at Clara Whitmore with new eyes. She'd handled herself with dignity under pressure, protected his pride without sacrificing her own, and made it clear that the Crawford Ranch was no longer a desperate man's failing enterprise, but a partnership with someone who knew exactly what she was worth. That was, "Thank you," Samuel said quietly after the riders had disappeared down the road. Clara shrugged, still holding Thomas, who had fallen back asleep against her shoulder. "Nobody wants a fat girl for a wife, Mr. Crawford. But sometimes they find out they need a strong woman for a partner. The question is whether you're ready to make that partnership real instead of just a convenient fiction." Samuel looked at his son, peaceful and healthy in this woman's arms, then at his kitchen, organized and functional for the first time since Ellen's death, then finally at Clara herself. Plain, practical, uncompromising, and absolutely invaluable. "I think," he said slowly, "we should discuss terms." The news of Clara Whitmore's arrival at the Crawford Ranch spread through Millfield like wildfire through dry grass. By Sunday morning, when the church bells rang across the valley, every person in the pews had heard some version of the story, most of them bearing little resemblance to the truth. Clara had expected this. Small towns fed on gossip the way cattle fed on grass, and a woman like her provided particularly rich fodder for the rumor mill. She dressed carefully for her first appearance at Sunday service, choosing her best dress, a deep green wool that was well made if not fashionable, that fit her properly without apology for her size. She'd learned long ago that confidence was the only armor that mattered when facing public judgment, and she wore it like a queen preparing for court. Samuel had been quiet during the ride to town, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms. The baby had thrived in the week since her arrival, his color healthy, his appetite strong, his disposition transformed from the fretful, sickly child she'd first encountered. The change was so dramatic that even Samuel seemed amazed by it, watching his son with the wonder of a man who'd been given back something he'd thought lost forever. "You don't have to do this," Samuel said as they approached the church. "Small towns can be unkind to strangers, especially women who don't fit their expectations." Clara smiled, adjusting Thomas's blanket. "Mr. Crawford, I've attended church services in mining camps where the congregation was outnumbered by the number of guns in the room. I think I can handle Millfield's Congregational Church." But as they walked through the church doors, Clara could feel the weight of every stare, hear the sharp intake of breath, the whispered conversations that died abruptly as they passed. She'd known it would be this way. The shock of seeing Samuel Crawford with a woman, the calculation of her worth, the immediate judgment that she was too fat, too plain, too obviously desperate to be worthy of respect. They took a pew near the middle of the church, Clara settling Thomas against her shoulder with the ease of long practice. The baby was a perfect angel, sleeping contentedly through the opening hymn, but Clara could feel the eyes on them like a physical pressure. She kept her own gaze forward, her expression serene, refusing to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Reverend Morris was a kind man who preached with genuine compassion, but even he seemed somewhat flustered by the unusual situation in his congregation. His sermon about charity and Christian acceptance felt pointed in a way that made Clara both grateful and slightly embarrassed. She didn't need special pleading. She just needed to be left alone to do her work and live her life. After the service, the real ordeal began. The church steps became a gauntlet of forced politeness and barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Millfield, approached with the predatory smile of a woman scenting scandal. "Samuel, dear, how wonderful to see you out and about. And little Thomas looks so much better. You must introduce us to your friend. This is Miss Clara Whitmore," Samuel said formally. "She's been helping with Thomas and managing the household." "How practical," Mrs. Henderson said, her gaze sweeping over Clara with the assessment of a horse trader evaluating livestock. "And where did you come from originally, Miss Whitmore? We do like to know about newcomers to our little community." "Philadelphia originally," Clara replied calmly, though I've been working in various households throughout the territories for the past several years. The word working hung in the air like a confession. In Mrs. Henderson's world, decent women didn't work. They married and were provided for. A woman who worked for her living was automatically suspect, and a woman who looked like Clara doubly so. How interesting, Mrs. Henderson said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. And you're staying at the Crawford place? That must be cozy. The implication was clear, and Clara felt her temper rise despite her best efforts to remain calm. But before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Might I say, Miss Whitmore, that Thomas looks absolutely flourishing? I don't believe I've ever seen such a transformation in a child's health. The speaker was Dr. Peterson, who had returned from Cheyenne the day before and heard about the miraculous recovery of his former patient. He was a man in his 60s, with the authority that came from being the only doctor for 50 miles in any direction. His opinion carried weight that even Mrs. Henderson couldn't dismiss. I was quite concerned about the boy when I left town, Dr. Peterson continued. Premature infants often struggle in their first year, and Thomas had been particularly delicate. Whatever care you've been providing, Miss Whitmore, has been remarkably effective. Clara inclined her head graciously. Thank you, doctor. I've had considerable experience with infant care, and Thomas is a strong child who simply needed the right kind of attention. Indeed, Samuel, you're very fortunate to have found such capable help. I imagine Mrs. Crawford would have been deeply grateful to know her son was in such good hands. The mention of Ellen Crawford shifted the atmosphere subtly. Even Mrs. Henderson couldn't quite bring herself to criticize a woman who was caring for the orphaned child of their beloved former neighbor. The sharp edges of judgment dulled slightly, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps practicality trumped propriety when a child's welfare was at stake. As they walked back to the wagon, Clara felt the familiar exhaustion that came from being constantly evaluated and found wanting. But there was something else too, a sense of having passed some crucial test. She'd faced down the town's judgment and emerged with her dignity intact. More importantly, she'd done it while holding Samuel's son, making it clear that her place at the Crawford Ranch was about more than her own needs. I'm sorry, Samuel said quietly as he helped her into the wagon. I should have warned you it would be like that. You don't need to apologize for other people's bad manners, Clara replied, settling Thomas more comfortably in her arms. Though I appreciate Dr. Peterson's intervention, it's nice to have one's work recognized by someone whose opinion matters. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then asked, Does it bother you? What they say. Clara considered the question seriously. It bothers me that people can be cruel without cause, but it doesn't bother me enough to change who I am or how I live my life. I've learned that the people whose opinions are worth having are usually too busy living their own lives to spend time judging others. As they drove home through the golden afternoon light, Thomas sleeping peacefully between them, Clara felt a sense of settling that she'd rarely experienced before. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was beginning to feel like the life she was meant to have. The town might gossip, Mrs. Henderson might disapprove, but here in this wagon with this man and this child, she felt something she'd almost given up hoping for. She felt like she belonged. That evening, as she prepared supper and Samuel worked on ranch accounts at the kitchen table, Thomas playing contentedly on a blanket nearby, Clara found herself humming an old song her mother used to sing. The kitchen was warm with lamplight and the smell of fresh bread, and for the first time in years, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from being exactly where she was supposed to be. Clara, Samuel said suddenly, looking up from his ledger. Yes, when you said we should discuss terms, I've been thinking about that, about what kind of partnership we might have. Clara's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. And what have you concluded? Samuel set down his pen, his expression serious. I've concluded that I've been thinking about it all wrong. I kept asking myself what I could offer you, what would make it worth your while to stay, but I think the real question is what we could build together. The words hung between them, full of possibility and promise. Clara felt her heart beating faster, but she kept her voice steady. What did you have in mind? A real partnership, equal shares in the ranch, in any profits we make, in the decisions about how to run things. Not an employer and employee, but two people working toward the same goals. Clara looked at Thomas, who was reaching for his wooden toy with increasing determination, then at Samuel, whose face was open and honest in the lamplight. And what about the rest of it? The gossip, the assumptions people will make? Samuel's jaw set with determination. Let them talk. They'll run out of things to say eventually, and meanwhile we'll be building something real here. Something that matters more than their opinions. Clara smiled, returning to her bread with hands that were no longer quite steady. Then I accept your terms, Mr. Crawford. Partners it is. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass like a blessing. And inside the Crawford ranch house, three people who'd found each other against all odds settled into an evening that felt like the beginning of everything important. 3 weeks into their partnership, trouble arrived at the Crawford ranch in the form of armed men and ultimatums. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Too much dust for ordinary travelers, moving too fast for any peaceful purpose. She immediately gathered the damp clothes, her instincts telling her to secure anything that might be damaged in whatever storm was approaching. "Samuel!" she called, her voice carrying the sharp edge of urgency that made him look up immediately from the fence he was mending. "Riders coming." "A lot of them." Samuel shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun, counting the approaching horses. His face grew grim as he recognized the lead rider. Jake Morrison, Marcus Thornfield's enforcer, a man who handled the bank's more unpleasant business with efficiency and brutality in equal measure. "Take Thomas and get inside," Samuel said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against the fence post. "Lock the door and don't come out no matter what you hear." Clara's chin lifted in the stubborn gesture Samuel had learned to recognize. "I'm not hiding in the house while you face trouble alone. We're partners, remember? That means we handle problems together. Clara, these aren't men who'll be impressed by your cooking or childcare skills. Morrison's dangerous, and if Thornfield sent him, then they're trying to intimidate you into selling, and a man standing alone looks a lot more vulnerable than a man with allies." Clara moved toward the house, but not to hide, to retrieve her own weapon, a shotgun she'd learned to use during her years of traveling alone. "Besides, Mr. Crawford, you might be surprised by what skills I've acquired in my travels." The riders thundered into the yard like a cavalry charge, deliberately dramatic in their arrival. Morrison was a big man, with small, cruel eyes, and the kind of swagger that came from years of never being told no. His companions were cut from similar cloth. Hired guns dressed as ranch hands, men who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. "Crawford," Morrison called out, not bothering to dismount. "Mr. Thornfield sent us to collect on your loan payment. Seems you're behind by, let's see." He made a show of consulting a piece of paper. 3 months now." Samuel stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "The payment isn't due until the end of the month, Morrison." "Same as it's been for the past 2 years." Morrison's smile was as pleasant as a rattlesnake's warning. "Funny thing about that, Mr. Thornfield reviewed the terms of your loan, and it seems there's a clause about maintaining the property in good condition. Word around town is you've been letting things slide since your wife passed. Barn needs repairs, fences are falling down, livestock's been getting into neighbors' crops." "That's a lie," Samuel said flatly. "This ranch is in better condition now than it's been in months." "Well, now that's where things get interesting." Morrison's gaze shifted to Clara, who had emerged from the house with Thomas in her arms and her shotgun slung across her shoulder with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. "See, having unmarried folks living together in sin, well, that affects the moral character of the property, doesn't it? Makes it the kind of place decent folks wouldn't want to be associated with." Clara felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest. She'd been judged before, dismissed and insulted, but never had her presence been used as a weapon against someone else. The unfairness of it, the calculated cruelty, made her angrier than she'd been in years. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms, "I'm curious about something. Does Mr. Thornfield's moral concern extend to the gambling debts his son runs up in Denver? Or the way he forecloses on widows while their husbands' graves are still fresh? Or perhaps the interesting accounting practices that let him buy struggling ranches for a fraction of their worth?" Morrison's face darkened. You'd best watch your tongue, woman. Men have gotten hurt for saying less than that. Men have gotten hurt for saying more, Clara replied evenly, shifting Thomas to her left arm, while her right hand rested on her shotgun. The question is whether you're the kind of man who threatens women holding babies, or whether you have some small remnant of decency left. The tension in the yard ratcheted up another notch. Morrison's men shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Samuel stepped slightly sideways, putting himself in a better position to cover Clara if shooting started. But Clara wasn't finished. I'm also curious, she continued, her voice conversational despite the danger crackling in the air, about the legal basis for Mr. Thornfield's sudden concern about moral character. You see, before coming to Wyoming, I spent some time in Denver working for a lawyer who specialized in contract law. Fascinating field. I learned quite a bit about what constitutes valid grounds for calling in a loan early. Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. What are you getting at? I'm getting at the fact that moral character clauses in loan agreements require specific evidence of criminal behavior or actions that directly impact property value. Personal disapproval doesn't qualify, and neither does gossip. Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. But filing false claims to intimidate borrowers? That's fraud. And using armed men to collect on debts that aren't actually due? That's extortion. One of Morrison's men leaned forward in his saddle. Jake, maybe we should— Shut up, Morrison snarled, his small eyes fixed on Clara with undisguised hatred. Think you're smart, don't you, fat girl? Think your book learning makes you something special? I think, Clara said quietly, that men who have to travel in packs to threaten women and children are usually compensating for some fundamental weakness. And I think Mr. Thornfield might be interested to know that his employees are creating legal liabilities he's not aware of. The standoff stretched out like a wire under tension, everyone waiting for someone to make the first move. Thomas began to fuss, perhaps sensing the danger in the air, and Clara automatically began the gentle swaying motion that soothed him. The sight of this woman, calm and competent in the face of mortal danger, protecting a child while facing down armed men, seemed to finally penetrate Morrison's hired courage. This ain't over, Morrison said finally, yanking his horse's head around with unnecessary violence. Tell Thornfield we'll be back when the payments actually due. And Crawford, you might want to reconsider your living arrangements. For the sake of the boy. As the riders thundered away, leaving the yard empty except for settling dust and the lingering smell of gunpowder that no one had fired, Samuel found himself looking at Clara Whitmore with something approaching awe. Where did you learn to handle men like that? He asked. Clara shifted Thomas to a more comfortable position, her hands finally beginning to shake slightly as the adrenaline wore off. You pick things up when you're a woman traveling alone. You learn to read men, to understand what they're really afraid of. Morrison's type, they're bullies. They rely on intimidation because they're not actually as tough as they pretend to be. And the legal knowledge? Clara smiled wryly. I really did work for a lawyer in Denver. I also worked for a banker in Colorado Springs, a judge in Santa Fe, and a federal marshal in Kansas City. When you're the kind of woman nobody notices, you hear a lot of things people assume you won't understand or remember. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what she just revealed. Clara Whitmore wasn't just a competent housekeeper and nursemaid. She was an educated woman with connections and knowledge that could prove invaluable in the challenges ahead. Clara, he said finally, yes? When this is over, when we've dealt with Thornfield and secured the ranch, I want you to know that you'll always have a place here. Not because I need help, but because— He struggled for words that could encompass everything he was feeling. Because you belong here. Because Thomas belongs with you. Because we've become something together that none of us were alone. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Samuel Crawford, if you're proposing to me in a dusty ranch yard while holding a shotgun, I'm going to need you to do better than that. Samuel laughed, the first genuine laughter Clara had heard from him since her arrival. Is that what I was doing? It sounded suspiciously like it. And while I appreciate the sentiment, a woman likes to be courted properly, even a fat girl who tends babies. As they walked back toward the house together, Thomas babbling contentedly in Clara's arms. Samuel found himself marveling at the strange turns life could take. 3 months ago, he'd been a broken man, barely holding on to his land and his sanity. Now he was walking beside a woman who'd faced down armed thugs without flinching, who'd protected his son and his interests with courage and intelligence, who'd somehow made his house feel like a home again. Clara? Yes. When I do propose properly, what should I know about your answer? Clara smiled, her face soft in the afternoon light. You should know that nobody wants a fat girl for a trophy wife, Samuel Crawford. But some of us make excellent partners for men wise enough to recognize quality when they see it. And as the sun set over the Wyoming Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, Samuel Crawford began planning the kind of proposal that a woman like Clara Whitmore deserved. Not because she was desperate enough to accept anything, but because she was strong enough to choose exactly the life she wanted. The confrontation Clara had been dreading arrived with the first snow of winter, carried on winds that howled across the prairie like banshees warning of trouble ahead. It had been 6 weeks since Morrison's visit, 6 weeks of watching the horizon for dust clouds, of sleeping with weapons close at hand, of knowing that Marcus Thornfield's patience was wearing thin. The loan payment had been made on time. Clara's careful management of the household expenses had freed up enough money to meet their obligations. But both she and Samuel knew that Thornfield wouldn't give up easily. Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the riders approaching. This time there was no mistaking their intent. They came in formation, armed and ready for war, led by Thornfield himself. 12 men, enough to overwhelm any resistance the Crawford ranch could mount. As she watched them through the window, Clara felt the cold certainty that this confrontation would end with blood spilled or lives destroyed. Possibly both. Samuel, she called quietly, not wanting to wake Thomas, who was sleeping peacefully in his cradle near the warm stove. They're here. Samuel emerged from the bedroom, already dressed and armed, his face set in the grim lines of a man who'd accepted what was coming. How many? 12. Thornfield's leading them himself this time. Samuel's jaw tightened. He's not planning to negotiate. Clara moved away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities and calculations. Samuel, listen to me. You need to take Thomas and ride for town. Get to Sheriff Morrison, not Jake, his Uncle Paul. He's an honest man who won't be in Thornfield's pocket. I'm not leaving you here alone to face. You're not leaving me, Clara interrupted firmly. You're protecting your son. Because that's what fathers do. They make sure their children survive, no matter what it costs them personally. Samuel stared at her, torn between love and duty, between his instinct to protect her and his responsibility to Thomas. What about you? Clara smiled, checking the loads in her shotgun with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to rely on her own strength. I'm going to buy you time. And I'm going to make Thornfield very sorry he decided to threaten a woman who's been underestimated her entire life. Before Samuel could protest, the sound of horses filled the yard, and Thornfield's voice boomed across the morning air. Crawford, come out here and face what's coming to you like a man. Clara kissed Thomas's forehead gently, then turned to Samuel with eyes that held no fear, only determination. Go. Now. Out the back door. Take the chestnut mare. She's fastest. Don't look back, and don't come back until you have the law with you. Clara! Go! Samuel grabbed his son in the prepared saddlebags, pausing only long enough to kiss Clara, quick and desperate and full of everything he couldn't say. I love you, he whispered against her lips. I know, Clara replied. Now prove it by keeping that baby safe. As Samuel slipped out the back door, Clara straightened her dress, checked her weapons one final time, and walked to the front door with the calm dignity of a queen preparing to meet her enemies. She opened it wide and stepped onto the porch, facing down 12 armed men with nothing but courage and the absolute conviction that some things were worth fighting for. Thornfield sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory, his expensive clothes and soft features a stark contrast to the hard men surrounding him. Miss Whitmore, I was hoping to speak with Crawford about a business matter. Mr. Crawford is unavailable, Clara replied evenly. But I'm his partner, so any business you have with the ranch, you can discuss with me. Thornfield's laugh was ugly, dismissive. Partner? Is that what you're calling it? I think the good people of Millfield would have other words for a woman living in sin with a married man. Mr. Crawford is a widower, as you well know. And what the people of Millfield think is considerably less important than what the law says about men who use armed intimidation to steal land from honest ranchers. Steal? Thornfield's voice rose in mock outrage. Miss Whitmore, I'm simply here to collect on a legitimate debt. The terms of Crawford's loan are quite clear, and I'm afraid recent events have triggered the early payment clause. Clara stepped forward, her shotgun held casually but visibly. Recent events? Your presence here, for one thing. The moral character clause is quite specific about irregularities that might affect property values. And then there's the matter of Crawford's obvious inability to maintain the property. Fences down, livestock wandering, general deterioration. That's interesting, Clara said conversationally, because Sheriff Morrison was here just last week inspecting the property for the tax assessment. He commented specifically on how well-maintained everything looked, even suggested we might qualify for the territorial improvement bonus next year. Thornfield's eyes narrowed. Sheriff Morrison is an old fool who can't see past his own nose. Perhaps, but Judge Henderson isn't, and neither is the Territorial Land Commission. They tend to take a dim view of banks that use fraudulent claims to seize property. Clara's voice remained perfectly pleasant, but her words carried the edge of a blade. They especially dislike it when those banks use armed men to intimidate witnesses. One of Thornfield's men shifted restlessly in his saddle. Boss, maybe we should— Shut up, Thornfield snarled. Miss Whitmore, you seem to be under the impression that your amateur legal knowledge can protect you. But the simple fact is that Crawford owes money he can't pay, and I have the right to collect by any means necessary. Actually, Clara said, you don't, because the loan was paid in full 2 days ago. I have the receipt right here. She reached into her dress pocket, producing a folded document that she held up for all to see. Thornfield's face went white, then red with rage. That's impossible. Crawford doesn't have that kind of money. Mr. Crawford doesn't, but I do. Clara's smile was sweet as poison honey. You see, before coming to Wyoming, I sold a small property I inherited from my grandmother. Cash on the barrelhead, as they say. More than enough to pay off the Crawford Ranch debt and secure a clear title to the land. The lie came easily, delivered with such conviction that even Clara almost believed it herself. In reality, she'd spent her last dollar paying for the wagon ride from town, but Thornfield had no way of knowing that. The receipt she held was real enough, a payment to the general store that would pass casual inspection in the dim morning light. Thornfield's mask of civilized behavior finally slipped completely. You lying bitch. There's no way a fat cow like you has that kind of money. And there's the truth at last, Clara said calmly. Not business, not law, not even money. Just a petty man's anger at being outmaneuvered by someone he considers beneath his notice. Thornfield yanked his revolver from its holster with shaking hands. I don't need legal justification to deal with a woman who doesn't know her place. Clara's shotgun came up smooth and fast, the twin barrels centering on Thornfield's chest before he could fully clear leather. Mr. Thornfield, I think you should know that I once shot 3 bandits who tried to rob a stagecoach I was riding. Killed 2 of them outright, left the 3rd wishing I had. Now you can holster that weapon and ride off my property like a civilized man, or you can find out whether a fat girl can shoot as well as she can cook. For a heartbeat, murder hung in the air between them, balanced on the edge of a trigger pull. Then the thunder of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell, and Sheriff Morrison rode into the yard with 6 armed deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Sheriff! Thornfield called out, relief flooding his voice. Perfect timing! This woman threatened me with a weapon. Sheriff Morrison was a different breed from his nephew Jake. Older, harder, with the kind of integrity that couldn't be bought or intimidated. He took in the scene with experienced eyes. 12 armed men surrounding one woman with a baby's cradle visible through the open door behind her. Looks to me like Miss Whitmore was defending herself against overwhelming odds, the sheriff said dryly. Thornfield, What's your business here? Debt collection. Crawford owes the bank money, and this woman has been interfering with legitimate business. Got a court order for that debt collection? Thornfield hesitated. I don't need... Actually, you do. New territorial law, passed last month. All debt collections involving real property have to go through the courts first. Sheriff Morrison's gaze shifted to Clara, who was slowly lowering her shotgun. Miss Whitmore, you all right? I'm fine, Sheriff. Just explaining to Mr. Thornfield that the Crawford Ranch is no longer indebted to his bank. That's so? Well then, I guess Mr. Thornfield and his men can be on their way. And Thornfield? The sheriff's voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who'd kept peace in violent country for 20 years. Next time you want to conduct business in my county, you come see me first. I don't like armed gangs riding around intimidating honest citizens. As Thornfield and his men rode away in defeat and humiliation, Clara finally allowed herself to sag against the porch railing, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush that left her shaking. Sheriff Morrison dismounted and approached with the careful respect of a man who just witnessed extraordinary courage. Miss Whitmore, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish. I'm not sure which. Clara managed a weak smile. Perhaps both, Sheriff. But some things are worth the risk. Where's Crawford and the boy? Safe. I sent them to town when I saw Thornfield coming. I thought this might not end well. Sheriff Morrison nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. But Miss Whitmore, about that paid-off loan... Clara met his eyes steadily. Yes? I hope Crawford knows what a remarkable woman he's got here, because any woman who'd face down 12 armed men to protect a man and his child, well, that's the kind of partner every man should be grateful to find. As the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Clara heard the sound of approaching horses from the direction of town. Samuel returning with Thomas, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the fear of what he might find. She straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and prepared to face the man who'd trusted her with everything he held dear. Samuel rode into the yard like a man expecting to find devastation, his eyes wild with worry until they found Clara standing whole and unharmed on the porch. He practically fell from his horse in his haste to reach her. Thomas clutched in his arms. Clara! My God, I heard shooting. Are you hurt? What happened to Thornfield? Clara took Thomas from his father's arms, kissing the baby's forehead before answering. Thornfield discovered that threatening a woman who's been underestimated her entire life can be a costly mistake. He won't be bothering us again. And the loan, Clara's smile was rueful. Well, that's going to require some creative financing. I may have exaggerated our financial position somewhat, but we have time now. Time to find real solutions instead of fighting off immediate threats. Samuel stared at her, this woman who'd saved his ranch, protected his son, and faced down armed killers without flinching. Clara Whitmore, he said solemnly, will you marry me? Is this your idea of a proper proposal? Clara asked, but she was smiling. No, Samuel said, dropping to one knee right there in the muddy yard, Thomas babbling contentedly in Clara's arms. Clara Whitmore, you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You've made my house a home, my son healthy and happy, and my life worth living again. I love you not because you were convenient or available, but because you're extraordinary. Will you marry me? Clara looked down at this man kneeling in the mud, proposing to a fat girl who just faced down 12 armed men, who'd chosen her, not despite her flaws, but because of her strengths. Samuel Crawford, she said softly, nobody wants a fat girl for a trophy wife, but I think you might want one for a true partner. Is that a yes? That, Clara said, bending to kiss him while Thomas clapped his hands in delight, is a yes. And as the Wyoming snow began to fall in earnest, covering the ranch in a blanket of white, as pure as wedding lace, Clara Whitmore finally found the home she'd been searching for. Not in a place, but in the heart of a man who saw her true worth and loved her for exactly who she was. Spring came early to the Wyoming Territory that year, painting the grasslands in shades of green and gold that seemed to promise new beginnings. Clara stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom. Their bedroom now, though they'd maintained careful propriety until the wedding, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn herself. It wasn't the elaborate gown she dreamed of as a young girl, but it was honest and beautiful in its simplicity, made with careful hands and worn with quiet pride. The wedding was to be small. Sheriff Morrison would perform the ceremony, Doc Peterson and his wife would stand as witnesses, and a handful of neighbors who'd come to respect Clara's strength and character would attend. Mrs. Henderson had initially refused the invitation with icy politeness, but Dr. Peterson's wife had made it clear that anyone who snubbed the woman who'd saved little Thomas Crawford's life would find themselves without medical care for their own families. It was amazing how quickly social attitudes could shift when practical consequences were involved. Samuel knocked softly on the door. "Clara, are you ready?" "Almost," Clara called back, taking one final look at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was still large, still plain by conventional standards, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. "Samuel?" "Yes. I need you to know something before we do this." Clara opened the door to face him, her expression serious. "I lied to Thornfield about having money to pay off the loan. We still owe the bank, and unless we can find a way to make the ranch more profitable." Samuel smiled, reaching out to cup her face gently. "Clara, I've been wanting to tell you something about that. Remember when I said I'd been thinking about what we could build together? Well, I've been corresponding with a cattle buyer in Denver. Seems there's a new market opening up for high-quality beef, and our grassland is perfect for raising the kind of cattle they want. With your management skills and my knowledge of ranching, we could triple our income within 2 years." Clara stared at him. "You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you?" "Months, actually. Ever since you told Morrison you were my partner. I realized you were right. We could build something together that neither of us could manage alone." "And you didn't think to mention this when I was facing down armed men?" Samuel's grin was unrepentant. "I thought you were handling the situation quite well on your own. Besides, I wanted to surprise you with the details as a wedding gift." Clara shook her head in amazement. "Samuel Crawford, you are either the most trusting man alive or completely insane." "Probably both. Is that a problem?" Clara stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, careful not to muss her carefully arranged hair. "Not for me. I've always preferred interesting men to sensible ones." The ceremony was held in the parlor of the ranch house, with late spring sunshine streaming through windows Clara had hung with wildflowers. Thomas, now walking and babbling in the enthusiastic way of toddlers, served as an unofficial ring bearer, though he was more interested in trying to eat the rings than deliver them. The words spoken were simple, traditional, but they carried the weight of promises freely given and gladly received. When Sheriff Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt something settle in her chest that she'd never experienced before. The deep security of knowing she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the life she was meant to live. The reception was a potluck affair on the front porch, with neighbors contributing dishes and well wishes in equal measure. Even Mrs. Henderson attended, though she remained stiffly formal throughout the festivities. But when Thomas toddled over to her with his arms outstretched, babbling "ma ma" in Clara's direction, something in the older woman's expression softened slightly. "He's a beautiful child," Mrs. Henderson admitted grudgingly. "Healthy and happy. That's not always easy to achieve with babies born so early." "Clara has a gift with children," Dr. Peterson said warmly. "I've never seen such a remarkable transformation in a patient. Thomas is thriving under her care." Mrs. Henderson looked at Clara with new eyes, perhaps seeing for the first time the competence and love that had been obvious to others from the beginning. "Yes, well, I suppose sometimes practical skills matter more than other considerations." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to acceptance that Clara could work with it. She smiled graciously and offered Mrs. Henderson another piece of wedding cake, content to let time and proximity do the work of changing minds that had been closed by prejudice. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to drift home to their own evening chores, Clara found herself standing on the porch with Samuel, watching the sun set over their land, truly their land now, in every sense that mattered. Thomas played at their feet, building elaborate structures with wooden blocks that immediately fell down, then starting over with the determined optimism of childhood. "Do you think they'll ever fully accept me?" Clara asked, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. Samuel considered the question seriously. Some will, some won't. But Clara, the people whose acceptance matters, they already see who you are. The rest, well, they'll come around or they won't. Either way, it won't change the fact that you're exactly the wife I wanted and the mother Thomas needed. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady reliability that had drawn her to him from the beginning. I love you, Samuel Crawford. Not because you were the only man willing to overlook my appearance, but because you were the only man wise enough to see past it. Nobody wants a fat girl, Samuel said softly, echoing the words that had brought them together. But some men are smart enough to recognize when they found exactly the woman they need, Clara finished. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Thomas finally fell asleep against Clara's shoulder, Samuel told her about his plans for expanding the ranch, about the cattle he wanted to buy, about the future he could envision now that he had a true partner to share it with. Clara listened with the attention of someone who understood that dreams shared were dreams that could become real. Later, after Thomas had been tucked into his crib and the house had settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, Clara and Samuel sat by the fire as husband and wife for the first time. There was no awkwardness between them, no uncertainty about their feelings or their future. They had been tested by hardship, proven in crisis, and bound together by something stronger than passion or convenience. They had chosen each other with full knowledge of who they were and what they could become together. Clara, Samuel said, reaching for her hand, I want you to know that I don't consider myself lucky to have found you. Lucky implies chance, and what we have, this feels like destiny. Clara smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. Destiny for a fat girl and a widowed rancher? That's quite a romantic notion, Mr. Crawford. Sometimes the most romantic stories are the ones about people who find exactly what they need instead of what they thought they wanted. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass with the sound of promises kept and dreams taking root. Inside the Crawford ranch house, three people who had found each other against all odds settled into their first night as a true family, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. And in the morning, Clara would wake as a married woman in her own home, with a husband who valued her strength and a son who called her mother, surrounded by the life she'd built with her own hands and protected with her own courage. She would cook breakfast in her own kitchen, tend her own garden, and plan improvements to her own ranch with the confidence of someone who finally completely belonged. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she stepped off that stagecoach months ago. It was infinitely better, real instead of imagined, earned instead of given, built on truth instead of illusion. And as Clara had learned through years of disappointment and rejection, the best gifts were often the ones you never thought to ask for. Nobody had wanted a fat girl, but one wise man had recognized a treasure disguised as something ordinary. And together they had created something extraordinary from the raw materials of hope, hard work, and love that saw clearly instead of settling for less than it deserved. The story of Clara and Samuel Crawford would be told in Millfield for generations, not as a tale of charity or desperation, but as proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the words, "then stay," and end with a lifetime of gratitude for the courage it takes to see past surface to soul. As winter settled over the Crawford ranch like a peaceful benediction, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Samuel and 3-year-old Thomas build a snowman in the yard. Thomas's laughter rang clear as the silver bells in the crisp air, and Samuel's deep chuckles provided a warm counterpoint. In her arms, baby Sarah, born the previous spring with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin, slept contentedly, dreaming whatever dreams babies dream. The ranch had prospered beyond even Samuel's optimistic projections. The cattle operation had expanded, the debt was paid, and they'd bought the adjoining property when old Mr. Henderson decided to move to California. But more than financial success, they had built something that mattered: a family, a home, a legacy of love that transcended every shallow judgment that had once been passed on Clara's worth. Mrs. Henderson had become, if not a friend, then at least a respectful neighbor who sought Clara's advice on difficult childcare situations and acknowledged her skill with genuine gratitude. The town of Millfield had learned to see Clara as she truly was. Not the fat girl nobody wanted, but the remarkable woman who had saved the Crawford Ranch, raised healthy children, and stood as an example of strength and grace under pressure. Dr. Peterson often brought his medical students to observe Clara's techniques with difficult babies, telling them that sometimes the best medicine came from experienced hands and a caring heart, rather than expensive treatments and complicated theories. Sheriff Morrison had recommended Clara to 3 other struggling ranchers who needed practical help managing their households and raising their children. But it was in the quiet moments like this, watching her husband play with their son while their daughter slept safely in her arms, that Clara felt the deepest satisfaction, not because she had proven anything to anyone else, but because she had finally found the place where she was meant to be. The door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and cold air along with Samuel and Thomas. Thomas immediately ran to Clara, his cheeks red with cold and excitement, chattering about the snowman's carrot nose and stick arms. Samuel stamped his boots and hung up his coat, then crossed to kiss Clara's forehead and stroke Sarah's soft hair. "Perfect afternoon for snowman building," he said, settling into his chair by the fire. "Thomas has decided our snowman needs a hat and a pipe, just like his Uncle Peter had." Clara smiled, remembering Samuel's brother who had visited last summer, a kind man who had taken one look at Clara and told Samuel he was the luckiest man alive. "There's an old hat in the trunk upstairs, and I think there's a corncob pipe in the barn." As Thomas scampered off to find treasures for his snowman, and Samuel stoked the fire to chase away the winter chill, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Philadelphia as an unwanted spinster, been rejected at a train station as unsuitable, and faced down armed men to protect the family she'd chosen. Each challenge had stripped away another layer of other people's expectations, leaving her free to become exactly who she was meant to be. "Nobody wants a fat girl." The words that had once cut like knives now seemed almost amusing in their ignorance. Because it turned out that the right man didn't want a pretty ornament or a convenient service provider. He wanted a partner strong enough to stand beside him through everything life could throw at them, wise enough to see solutions when problems seemed overwhelming, and loving enough to build a family that would thrive for generations. The story that had begun with rejection and desperation had become a testament to the truth that worth was determined not by other people's limited vision, but by the courage to claim your own value and the wisdom to recognize it in others. Clara Whitmore Crawford had found her home not by becoming what someone else wanted, but by being exactly what she was, and finding the man wise enough to treasure that gift. As the snow continued to fall outside their warm, bright kitchen, 3 generations of the Crawford family settled into an evening that felt like every blessing Clara had ever hoped for, wrapped in the security of love that had been tested by fire and found to be pure gold. Sometimes the best love stories don't begin with once upon a time. Sometimes they begin with nobody wants and end with gratitude so deep it changes everything that comes after. And sometimes the most beautiful endings are really just the beginning of something even more wonderful. A lifetime of proving that the heart always knows quality when it finds it, regardless of the package it comes in. Nobody had wanted a fat girl, but love had wanted Clara Whitmore exactly as she was, and that had made all the difference in the world. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you believe love isn't about perfection, but about presence, patience, and the courage to see past surfaces to souls, then don't just ride off into the sunset. Stay a while. Tell us in the comments what moment broke you or healed you. And if you're drawn to stories where dust meets devotion, where the Wild West wasn't just wild but deeply human, hit that subscribe button. Join Wild West Love Stories and ride with us every week, where bullets missed but hearts didn't.